Julius Caesar had successfully subdued the Spanish provinces in a swift and impressive campaign, but this victory was overshadowed by setbacks elsewhere. At least 3.5 legions had been lost in North Africa and Illyricum during his absence. These defeats were humiliating, and Caesar could not afford any further losses. Meanwhile, Pompey was in Greece, seemingly amassing a massive army. As Pompey's recruitment efforts gained traction, the political tide began to turn. Many senators who had previously remained neutral decided to openly side with Pompey. Cicero was conflicted. In his view, Caesar and Pompey were equally indifferent to the rule of law. Cicero privately admitted his fear that no matter who emerged victorious in the war, a military dictatorship seemed the most likely outcome. After months of uncertainty, Cicero eventually persuaded himself that if a military dictatorship was inevitable, it would be better if it had the nominal backing of the Senate. This way, when normal politics eventually resumed, the Senate would be in a better position to rebuild. Reluctantly, Cicero decided to join Pompey and the Senate in Greece. In Greece, Cicero met Domitius Ahenobarbus, who had recently arrived from Massilia after a confrontation with the Caesarians. Although Cicero and Domitius were different in many ways, they found common ground on several issues. Both men noted that Pompey had become incuriously authoritarian since the beginning of the Civil War. Cicero's fear of military dictatorship seemed entirely justified. Cicero and Domitius resolved to curb this behavior going forward. While Pompey and the Senate continued to gather strength in the east, Caesar returned to home, where he immediately faced a significant challenge. Without the Senate's backing, Caesar needed to gather as much legitimacy as possible. Occupying the capital had helped in this regard, but now basic Roman politics were beginning to unravel. By custom, that year's consuls were supposed to oversee the election of the next year's consuls. However, Rome's consuls were in Greece with Pompey, making the election impossible. Without elections, it was difficult for Caesar to argue that his government was legitimate. Caesar suggested allowing a low-ranking official to oversee the elections, but this was an unpredicted proposal, and Rome's religious officials rejected it. Marcus Lepidus, one of the few remaining elected officials in Rome, proposed to the Senate, or what was left of it, that they name Caesar dictator, a position intended to temporarily grant one individual full political power. This would allow Caesar to hold the election himself, without the need for 2 incumbent consuls. Although the Senate was scarcely in session, those present agreed to Lepidus' proposal. Without such opposition, Caesar was named dictator, and as a dictator, he personally oversaw the elections. Unsurprisingly, Caesar was elected consul for the year 48, along with one of his loyal supporters. Let's pause to remember that the root cause of the Civil War was a disagreement over whether Caesar should be allowed to stand for election. Now, less than a year later, he was overseeing his own election as consul, a moment that must have been particularly satisfying for him. 11 days later, Caesar resigned as dictator, no longer needed dictatorial power once he held the consulship. Around this time, Caesar had the Senate pass a law that finally fulfilled his promise to grant Roman citizenship to the people of Cisalpine Gaul. This was a long-awaited and significant event. Caesar's legions, which was disproportionately composed of men from Cisalpine Gaul and the surrounding regions, were undoubtedly pleased that their families and friends had just been granted citizenship. Any concerns Caesar had about the loyalty of his legions could be set aside, at least for the moment. Moreover, with the passage of this law, Caesar created a new voting bloc that was singularly loyal to him, ensuring he would have the power influence elections for decades to come. With domestic politics under control, it was time to resume the civil war. However, there was a major problem. Italy was under blockade, and the land route through Illyricum, which passed through a mountain range controlled by Pompey's force, was impassable. Caesar needed to find a way to break the blockade, but there was an additional complication. Caesar had only enough ships to transport half of his army at a time, meaning he would need to break the blockade not just once, but 3 times, first to Greece, then back to Italy, and finally to Greece again. To make matters worse, Caesar's old adversary, Bibulus, was in charge of the blockade, and it was clear that this resolute opponent would not relent. The Caesarians had no choice but to take the risk. Caesar officially took office as consul on January 1st of 48 BCE, and just 3 days later he set sail. It had been almost exactly a year since he had crossed the Rubicon. Bibulus was caught off guard by Caesar's winter crossing, and understandably so. Crossing in winter was extremely hazardous. At that time of year, Bibulus had most of his ships safely in harbor, but Caesar knew something Bibulus didn't. This wasn't truly a winter crossing, it was more like an autumn one. The Roman calendar drifted out of alignment each year, and it was the responsibility of the Pontifex Maximus to correct it periodically. That position was held by none other than Julius Caesar. However, having been aboard for a decade, Caesar had not adjusted the calendar. By this point, the calendar was so off that it claimed early January when, in reality, it felt more like early October. Bibulus acted as if it were January, while Caesar treated it as October. Sailing in October was risky, but not impossible, and Caesar took that gamble. The first half of Caesar's army crossed the sea without incident. By the time the empty ships were returning to Italy, Bibulus realized what was happening and quickly mobilized his fleet. Most of Caesar's ships managed to get back just before Bibulus' blockade tightened behind him. This was not the outcome Bibulus had intended. Caesar was now isolated. The situation was precarious, and disaster loomed. Pompey was using the nearby city of Deirhotium as his main supply depot. When with Caesar now cut off from Italy, he desperately needed those supplies. Caesar, with his small half-army, marched toward the city. Pompey responded immediately, moving to intercept him. This was not how Caesar had planned things. Upon learning that Pompey was approaching, Caesar withdrew to the south and secured a strong defensive position near a river. Eventually, Pompey's army arrived and set up camp on the opposite side of the river. Neither side was willing to relinquish their position. Pompey was hesitant to attack a fortified location, and Caesar was equally determined to hold it. The two armies found themselves in a stalemate, each waiting for the other to make a move. It was clear that the stranded Caesarians would eventually run out of food. Their only hope was for reinforcements from Italy to arrive before that happened. The Caesarians in Italy made several attempts to cross, but each time they were driven back. Ancient Roman ships weren't built for long voyages, so every 2 or 3 days the crew had to come ashore to gather food and water. In response, Caesar began sending patrol along the coast with orders to attack these crews on sight, hoping to strain the blockade. It worked. Before long, Bibulus sent his second-in-command to negotiate with Caesar. His terms were simple: allow us to come ashore and resupply. Caesar asked in exchange for what? The envoy, puzzled, replied, "What?" Caesar responded, "What will you give me in return?" The envoy admitted, "I am not authorized to offer anything." Frustrated, Caesar retorted, "What do you think negotiations are?" The envoy, flustered, could only stammer, "What?" Caesar dismissed him, saying, "Get out of here." Not long after, Bibulus died, ironically securing his place in history as a symbol of an ineffective negotiation. While the Bibulus Award for poor negotiation might be fictional, it would certainly be a fitting tribute. Weeks turned into months, with no reinforcement arriving for Italy. The Caesarians' half-army remained stranded throughout the entire winter. Finally, in the spring, ships managed to slip past the blockade and deliver the much-needed reinforcements. Although the Caesarians were still outnumbered, they now had a fighting chance. However, even with the full Caesarian army assembled, they were still cut off and dangerously low on food. Caesar tried to provoke Pompey into battle, but Pompey, aware of Caesar's worsening supply situation, refused to engage, preferring to wait and strengthen his position. Caesar then surprised Pompey by suddenly marching towards Dehacium, intending to seize the supply depot. The Caesarians encamped on a hill just outside the city, with the Pompeian close behind. Caesar held a superior position, but he faced a difficult dilemma. He needed to hold the hill while also seizing the supply depot. If he attacked the city, the Pompeians would likely attack the hill. If he didn't, his army would starve. The situation grew so dire that the Caesarians were reduced to eating animal feed. To deter Pompey from attacking the hill, Caesar ordered his men to start building a wall. Pompey, seeing this, though it was a brilliant move, his plan was to starve the Caesarians into submission, so he began constructing his own wall to trap them. It became a race. Whichever side completed their wall first would encircle the other army. Over the following days and weeks, both sides launched raids to disrupt each other's construction. Caesar's wall eventually stretched over 31 kilometers, while Pompey's was just under 28. Caesar was narrowly winning the race, which allowed him to cut off Pompey's water supply. Even though Caesar's men were starving, it was now Pompey who faced a time constraint. He began probing Caesar's wall for weaknesses. Without warning, Pompey launched an attack on a section of Caesar's wall with 4,000 to 5,000 men. Only 700 Caesarians were stationed in the area, with reinforcements several kilometers away. These 7 men fought fiercely, and according to reports, nearly every one of them was injured by the time reinforcements arrived. Yet somehow, they managed to hold the wall, and the Pompeians retreated. As time went on, the raids grew more intense. Eventually, Pompey caught a break. 2 Gauls from Caesar's army defected and revealed weaknesses in Caesar's defenses. Seizing the opportunity, Pompey launched a nighttime assault on a section of the wall near the coast with a force of 2,500 to 3,000 men. This time, the Pompeians broke through, overwhelming the Caesarians and forcing them to retreat. Mark Antony brought up reinforcements and managed to stabilize the situation by setting up a secondary line of defense, but the damage was done. The Pompeians had captured a crucial section of Caesar's wall. Over time, the lines of fortification had shifted, and Pompey used this victory to capture one of Caesar's abandoned forts in no man's land. Caesar realized this was a serious tactical setback. This fort, however, was far from the main action, making it difficult to reinforce. Caesar sent a detachment to attack the fort using a circuitous route to avoid detection. The plan initially succeeded. The Pompeians were caught off guard as the Caesarians burst through the walls. But to their dismay, they discovered that Pompeians had built a secondary set of walls inside the fort. The Caesarians were now trapped between 2 fortifications, and as the fighting intensified, their situation worsened. Some Caesarians decided to circle around and attack the fort from the other side. However, in the chaos of battle, they became disoriented and mistakenly followed the 28-kilometer Pompeian wall away from the fight. By this time, the Pompeians had regrouped and launched a counterattack. The Caesarians, who had wandered off, were now isolated and vulnerable. The entire plan backfired. Pompey ordered his cavalry to encircle and attack the lost Caesarians, who broke and fled. Seeing their comrades fleeing in the distance, the Caesarians still at the fort assumed the battle was lost. Panic spread, and they attempted to flee as well, but being trapped between the 2 walls created a bottleneck, causing chaos. Caesar tried to stop the route, but he couldn't. The situation became so desperate that one of Caesar's own men attempted to kill him with a spear, only to be thwarted by Caesar's bodyguards, who saved his life. In the wake of the Battle of the Deirhotium, Labienus, Caesar's former second-in-command, who was now serving under Pompey, made it a point to visit the captured Caesarian soldiers. He denounced his former comrades as traitors to the Republic and personally ensued that each one was executed. Labienus was truly dedicated to his new alliance. Caesar had faced a defeat. He was out of supplies, out of options, and had no choice but to attempt to retreat. He was taken aback when Pompey didn't try to prevent him from withdrawing. Caesar remarked to his advisors that the enemy would have won that day if they had been led by a true victor. Following their triumph at Deirhotium, many of Pompey's advisors urged him to seize the opportunity and sail to Italy to reclaim Rome. However, Pompey disagreed, arguing that such a move would make it appear as though he was afraid to face Caesar, an unusual claim to make after winning a battle. Additionally, Pompey believed that Caesar's army was weak and deteriorating. He thought that by remaining patient, the decisive strike would come later in the year. That chance presented itself a month later, near the city of Pharsalus. I've detailed the Battle of Pharsalus elsewhere, and I'll provide a link to it at the end of this. But there's a brief overview of the events. Pompey positioned his forces next to a river, intending to launch his main assault on the left flank, with Domitius Ahenobarbus commanding the infantry and Labienus leading the cavalry. Both were skilled commanders with experience fighting with or against Caesar. Pompey's plan was to let Caesar come to him and then spring a trap. When the enemies met, Labienus had a cavalry charge on the left. Caesar, anticipating this, had reinforced his infantry reserves on that side, including an extra line of spearmen concealed behind his ranks. Labienus' cavalry charged directly into the spearmen and quickly fell into disarray, leading to a complete rout. Seizing the opportunity, Caesar pushed forward with all his reserves. Domitius tried to hold the line, but with the Pompeians' cavalry in full retreat and his infantry outnumbered, his forces soon began to flee as well. Some accounts say Domitius died fighting, while others claim he was stabbed in the back while trying to escape. After the collapse of Pompey's left flank, the rest of his army had little chance. The center and right flank crumbled, and the battle ended with Caesar's victory. Back at the camp, Cicero, Cato, and many of Rome's most prominent politicians awaited news of the battle. When they learned of Pompey's defeat, they were disheartened. Cato proposed making Cicero the new leader of Pompeian faction, which was reasonable given that, as a former consul, Cicero was one of the highest-ranking politicians present. Unlike Pompey, Cicero was an experienced statesman and strategist, but the outcome of Pharsalus had sealed their fate. During their discussion, the idea of Cicero leading the Pompeians seemed logical. As a former consul, Cicero was not only one of the highest-ranking politicians present, but also politically astute, and had maintained a relatively decent relationship with Caesar. Whether Cato and Cicero were considering a negotiation settlement during this conversation is unclear, but it represents as an intriguing what-if scenario. Cicero, however, declined the leadership role, stating that the civil war was essentially over, and that his aim was to return to Rome to influence the peace process. Cicero had initially justified joining the Pompeians on the grounds that if a military dictatorship was inevitable, it was better if it had the nominal support of the Senate. By returning to Rome, Cicero hoped to ensure that the Senate retained some of its authority. Although Cato disagreed with Cicero's reasoning, he represented his decision. Cato chose to lead the remaining Pompeians to North Africa to continue the struggle. The two men parted ways, never to meet again. Pompey, however, did not join the rest of Pompeians. Instead, he boarded a ship bound for Egypt. The Egyptian pharaoh owed Pompey a significant favor, and Pompey hoped that his debt would be repaid with a new army. Nearly 2 months later, Pompey arrived in Egypt. After a lengthy wait, he was granted an audience with the pharaoh. A small boat was sent to bring him ashore. The crew greeted him in Latin, but when Pompey attempted to converse, they remained silent, a foreboding sign. As the boat reached the shore, Pompey stood up, and a man behind him did the same, drawing his sword and stabbing Pompey in the back. There was a brief struggle, but Pompey fell, pulling his toga over his face in his final moments, a gesture the Roman considered a dignified way to die. Pompey Magnus was dead. Many believed that the civil war was now over. Caesar wielded unrivaled political power, but how he would use it remained uncertain.